pleasure to introduce you to the American Constitution Society, Georgia Laureate Chapter 2020-21, let's try that one more time, 2021 Legal Legends Award. So we're here to honor the Honorable Judge Beverly B. Martin. My name is Adam Sparks. I'm the co-chair of the American Constitution Society, Georgia Laureate Chapter Executive Committee. And what that mouthful actually means is I help try to put things like this together to advance ACS's cause of progressive constitutionalism here in the state of Georgia. For those of you who aren't familiar with ACS, it's a nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. The idea is to realize the promises of the U.S. Constitution by building and leading a diverse legal community that dedicates itself to advancing and defending democracy, justice, equality, and liberty, to securing a government that secures the public interest, and to guarding against abuse of law and the concentration of power. I think we can all agree that those are goals worthy of our time, our effort, and our treasure here today. We gain a lot by coming together, by communing in person, by talking to one another, and by sharing our stories. We're grateful to be able to do so here tonight. I'm grateful to each of you for masking up while we're indoors. I'm grateful to you for caring about the well-being of the person in the seat next to you and behind you, and the people who depend on that person for their livelihood. So thank you for that. A couple of housekeeping notes. We did lose a few people during the reception, I presume because of the excellent food and wine that we're trying. But we've also gained a number of people here on the live stream, and I want to thank those who couldn't be with us in person for joining us through the magic of the internet, that wonderful series of tubes, to be here to help honor Judge Martin. Oh, there are some people who are in D.C. back in the office. I appreciate that courtesy laugh. That's kind. I want to thank in particular our sponsors. I want to thank Gideon's Promise, King and Spalding, Chilivis, Grubman, Dalbey, and Warner, Edward Krugman, Emmett Bondurant, Jane Faye, Jason Carter, and as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to thank my firm Krevolin and Horst for being so generous in the sponsorship tonight. So we can all give a round of applause for our sponsors. I also need to recognize a few people. There are I see an ocean of luminaries here before me tonight, and I could say something about just about every one of you. And I'd like to, but we'd also like to get home at a reasonable hour. So I want to thank 5 people very quickly as a point of personal privilege. First, I want to thank Jeff Horst, who made this event possible tonight. And with his wonderful taste in wine that those of you here present today enjoy. I want to thank our student volunteers, Nick Smith, Alyssa Rogowski, and Holly Howell, who are here as a courtesy and out of the goodness of the heart to make sure that we all got here safely and got to the right place on time. So join me in thanking them tonight as well. And you may not acknowledge this, you may actually have escaped upstairs, but I want to thank Krugman and Horst's marketing director, Ashley Farrell, who gave a great amount of her time and her effort during a very busy couple of weeks to make sure this event came together at a reasonable cost, at a reasonable place, and in an enjoyable way. So Ashley, wherever you are, thank you. This could not have happened without you. So as much as we gain here tonight by being together, I'm well aware that we live in a time of loss. One of the reasons that ACS, Georgia Laureate Chapter, has not had as many of the in-person events that we so love and cherish as we commune and look forward to a better nation is because of the deadly pandemic that has cost us so many of our friends, our colleagues, our fellow citizens, and our residents, and the people that we love. I'm struck today that today we lost a giant of Georgia public service, Senator Max Cleland. I saw a report in the AJC today that in the Vietnam War, the 2017 documentary directed by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, the voice you first hear is his. And he said, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in the suffering," quoting Friedrich Nietzsche. There's something to that in the years that we live today. And there's something to finding meaning, not just in suffering, I would argue, but also in remembrance. Remembrance of those we've lost, remembrance of the injustices that we seek to correct, remembrance of why we are here as citizens to make a better nation for ourselves, for our fellow woman and man, and for posterity. That's something I think we can celebrate tonight. That's why we come here to honor a legal legend, for someone who has these values in mind and lived them every day in a long career of public service that is nowhere close to concluding. So, very happy to be here tonight, very happy to have all of you here tonight. You've heard enough from me. I do want to briefly introduce a representative from the National Organization of the American Constitution Society who will tell you a little bit more about the organization and about why we should all be so happy to be here today, Mr. Zack.
Thank you, Adam. I learned earlier today that you have a background in theater, and if I had known that and then had a preview of your speech, I would have objected harder to follow. But I want to thank you, Megan, and the entire ACS Georgia team. I especially want to thank tonight's sponsors as well, including Krevolin and Horst for hosting us today. And if you aren't a member of ACS or would like to become a sponsor, please visit acslaw.org/Georgia. There's a vanity URL, and I think it's going to test my ability to fundraise, so please do it. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here in Georgia today with the Georgia Lawyer Chapter of ACS. I did have to put on a tie for this event for the first time in 2 years. I'm happy to do it for this cause. The Georgia Chapter of ACS has been doing critical work to strengthen our democracy, fight for equality, and uphold the rule of law. ACS's mission is to ensure the law is a force to improve the lives of all people, and the Georgia Chapter of ACS is certainly doing that work. And I'm honored to be here to help celebrate Judge Martin. My work at ACS focuses on building a pipeline of legal talent. In a lot of ways, what we're really trying to do is find the future Judge Beverly Martins. Judge Martin embodies so much of what ACS is about. She has admirers throughout the ACS network. Lawyers and judges from across the country reached out to us with kind words for her when they saw that we were holding this event. And she has a permanent fan club in ACS's staff. She's a frequent attendee of our national convention, and not only does she attend, but we see her scribbling notes, paying attention more closely than almost anybody else. So much work goes into making sure that the programming, the substantive panels are thoughtful and informative, and seeing someone of Judge Martin's stature being so engaged really means a lot to all of us. She's also served as a mentor to countless lawyers and law students, and is generous with her time and advice to aspiring judges. There's so many ways a lawyer can make a difference in the world, and Judge Martin has done all of them. This evening is a celebration of her career on the bench, but I know that ACS will continue to work with her both nationally and in Georgia. I also think that's enough for me, so I'm going to turn it over to Eliza McDuffie. Eliza is the Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Southern Center for Human Rights, where she is part of the Impact Litigation Unit. Her work focuses on ending the use of solitary confinement and ending solitary confinement for young people in Georgia. Prior to joining SCHR, she clerked for Judge Martin in the 11th Circuit and worked for the MacArthur Justice Center's Supreme Court and Appellate Program. Eliza.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I am aware that Judge Martin has retired and is no longer a judge, but as her former law clerk, she will always be judge to me, so please just bear with me as I refer to her by her former title. I had the honor of clerking for Judge Martin during her final year on the court, and as a kind of natural consequence of that, I've done a lot of thinking about her legacy. What immediately comes to mind is Judge Martin's role as this iconic, powerful dissenter. And I could spend hours listing all of the times when Judge Martin was the only one saying what was true in a case, the only one calling out government abuse, or the only one standing up for the underdog. But what I want to do tonight is highlight some things about Judge Martin that you all may not know, and that in my eyes make her especially deserving of this award. The first is that Judge Martin has always cared deeply about the litigants that come before her. There's a mantra in Judge Martin's chambers that she would say over and over again. Every case we handle is the most important thing happening in someone's life. This meant she approached every case with the same seriousness, no matter how obvious the result might seem, and no matter how much money or legal skill the parties had. Judge Martin's care for litigants also influenced the way that she wrote. Our mandate from Judge was to write so that the parties to the litigation could understand exactly why relief was granted or denied. I even remember one instance from my clerkship year where Judge Martin wrote separately for the sole purpose of making sure that a litigant who was incarcerated would understand why his case had been dismissed. She never lost sight of the people who were affected by her decisions. Judge Martin is also extremely humble and had a sincere appreciation for everyone who helped run the court. When I think about this, I recall a moment from Judge Martin's final oral argument sitting this past June. It was the only sitting that we were all able to attend in person, and so Judge took all 5 of us to Miami. Those of you who know Judge Martin know that she loves Miami, so it was a great time. On the final day of the sitting, Judge Martin's very last time sitting as a judge after 21 years, she made a speech from the bench. She spoke eloquently and from the heart about the oath judges take to do justice equally for the rich and the poor. There was hardly a dry eye in the courtroom. At the end of the speech, Judge Martin did something that is so classically her. She turned the attention completely away from herself. She spoke about how hard all of the staff at the 11th Circuit work, and specifically, she made sure that everyone in the courtroom knew that the incredible courtroom deputy, Stephanie, gets to work at 5 a.m. on any day that there's an oral argument. To me, this just showed exactly what kind of person Judge Martin is. She had all of this power and all of this prestige, but just absolutely no ego. It was never about her. This is also evident, I think, from the fact that Judge Martin didn't take senior status, but instead fully retired from the bench. Something my co-clerks and I would talk about a lot is how special and really how rare it was that we got to watch someone give up power in this way. And this wasn't lost on Judge Martin. After her final day as a judge, we were all having celebratory drinks in her apartment, and she said something to the effect of, "The amount of power I'll have in the morning is nothing compared to the amount of power I have right now." She knowingly relinquished that power in order to have more of an impact. I am so grateful to have that example in my life, and I can't wait to see all the good that she does in this next phase. Now, I would be remiss to stand up here and talk about Judge Martin without mentioning just how hard she worked. She's so humble that she would never say this herself, but I am not exaggerating when I say that Judge Martin is one of the hardest working people I have ever met. One of the consequences of writing separately so often is that there's simply more work to be done, and Judge Martin never shied away from that, even though it meant working many nights and weekends. She would do whatever it took to say what was right and to do so in a way that was kind and respectful. She also somehow did this while maintaining tons of friends and a packed social calendar, so I feel like we all have a lot to learn from her. So I began this introduction by talking about Judge Martin's role as a legendary dissenter, and she has more than earned that title. But I don't want her legacy as writing prolific dissents to overshadow all of the times when her presence on a case changed the result. So before I turn it over to Judge Martin, I want to give just a few examples from my clerkship year alone where she was able to effect immediate change. In her final year as a judge, Judge Martin co-authored 2 critically important en banc decisions, one that allowed punitive damages for incarcerated people who have suffered mental or emotional injury, and another that made it harder for prosecutors to introduce evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Judge Martin authored an opinion over a dissent, staying an execution that the state of Alabama was trying to carry out in clear violation of the Constitution. And she helped overturn at least 2 convictions this past year, one of which we all agreed in chambers was the result of one of the most unjust prosecutions we had ever seen. And she helped delay at least 5 deportations. And those are just a few examples from a single year. There are countless people whose lives are better because Judge Martin touched their case. I am so proud to have been her law clerk, and it is a joy and an honor to present her with the 2021 Legal Legends Award.
Wanted you to know Eliza, because it's always a special success for me when one of my law clerks who didn't grow up in Georgia actually stays on in Georgia after their clerkship. And Eliza grew up in New York. I can't take entire credit for her staying, but she's going to make Georgia better, and we're delighted that you're here, and I'm glad you now know Eliza when you see her next. She is one of about 50 young lawyers that worked with me during my time as a judge. If you were my law clerk, raise your hand. If you clerk for the court, I know there were a lot of other, raise your hand as well, yeah. The law clerks showed up with inspiration for me that I tended to need from time to time. And that doesn't even mention the work that they had to do. Ours was a busy court. We wrote a lot separately, and so it meant a lot of hard work for them, but they contributed so greatly to the quality of work of the court. So thank you, Eliza. Thank you to my clerks. I didn't really quite realize the sense of this. This room is full of people that I love. It's kind of hard to give a speech to people that you love. I'm not sure this is quite a fit, but I'm gonna muscle through. Of course, there's some here tonight that I think of as legal legends. People who have inspired me, but mostly all of us look to those of you who are newer in the profession to inspire us for the work that needs to be done, and especially now needs to be done. So I consider myself to be talking to current and future legal legends. So what are the makings of a legal legend? I was lucky enough once to hear Elie Wiesel speak at a commencement address. As you know, he was, as a child, he was a prisoner in one of the Nazi death camps. He said, the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. And he said his formula for avoiding indifference was to study the suffering of others. He remembered himself as a prisoner. He said there's nothing worse than believing as a prisoner that you've been forgotten. I know many of you here have helped prisoners, Sarah Tatanchi, I see. That was a real gift to me of being a judge, that I was able to study the suffering of those incarcerated. And then once you're clear about your values, you've done away with the indifference. What do you do when you find yourself in a process that doesn't reflect the values? And this is really what I want to talk to you about, and it's really the process of speaking up for what you think is right. In some circles, we call this dissents. I just finished a book called The Great Dissenter. Maybe some of you have read it. It's about Justice John Marshall Harlan, written by Peter Canellis. And of course, Justice Harlan is a historic figure who's remembered most as a dissenting justice on the United States Supreme Court. His most famous dissent was probably in Plessy versus Ferguson, where he was the sole dissenter. But he was known for other dissents as well. One of those that I'm going to speak about is his dissents in the civil rights cases in 1883, when he'd been on the court about 6 years. The way Canellis describes it, the civil rights cases, they were cases brought on behalf of the newly freed slaves. One of them dealt, for example, with the right of freedmen to serve on juries. Another one dealt with the broader question of access by African Americans to railroads, inns, and theaters. Now, the majority of the court held that the 14th Amendment really offered no help to these freed people against this type of discrimination that was taking place in the states. Canellis says that 43 judges ruled on those civil rights cases, and only one held the position that the 14th Amendment should extend relief to these people who were being discriminated against. So 1 out of 43, I don't think I ever had to. It's pretty impressive. So you wonder what equipped Justice Harlan to stand up against that kind of, solid wall of opposition. How did he become a legal legend? By all accounts, he was a gregarious guy. He wasn't a loner, he wasn't a contrarian, he wasn't aloof. He really liked people, enjoyed people, and he wanted people to like him. He was a great storyteller. He taught law classes at Columbian University, which is now George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and crowds would show up to his law classes. He was funny. One of the things that he would routinely do is he would teach his class the principles that he was asserting in his dissents. And he would spend a lot of time with them going through the background of his dissents, the principles that they were based on, and then at the end he would say, but of course I'm wrong. So when I read that story, I thought, well, not only was he a greater dissenter than I, but he was also a better person, because when anybody asks me or compliments me on one of my dissents, my answer is always, well, it's a lot easier to write when you're right. But despite his desire to be liked, he never shied away from setting out his views when he thought his colleagues were wrong. Some people speculate that that was related to his religious faith. He was very devout. He taught Sunday school every Sunday, and some people believe that his religious faith gave him what he felt to be a moral obligation to answer for the judicial opinions that he participated in. Another view relates to the fact that he was born in Danville, Kentucky. He was born, of course, into a slave-holding household, and he owned slaves himself as a young man. But somehow from that background, he established relationships with the enslaved people that he knew, and allowed those relationships and his observations about the treatment of the enslaved people to transform him into the person who we now know as the Great Dissenter. One of the most significant people that crossed paths with John Marshall Harlan was Robert Harlan. He was a young man, a mixed race child who was raised by John Marshall Harlan's father, just like a son. So he was like John Marshall Harlan's brother, and some people say, in fact, they were brothers. But John Marshall Harlan saw the discrimination that Robert experienced. Robert Harlan joked that he had 1 half day of schooling, and that's because he was presented at school. Here's this darker child, and as soon as he came to the attention of the people in charge of the school, he was swiftly removed from the premises. But despite this discrimination, Robert Harlan went on to great success. He garnered great wealth and political influence, and it's true that some of the success that John Marshall Harlan experienced in life was because of the help given to him by this child that he was raised with, Robert Harlan. So I reread some of Justice Harlan's dissents in preparation for tonight, and I was struck by a couple of things. One, he was very prescient in his view. He was concerned about the long-term deleterious effects that race discrimination would have on our country. He wrote beautifully about that. He said, "There cannot be in this republic any class of human beings in practical subjugation to another class with power, and the latter to dole out to the former such privileges as they may choose to grant." So he really foresaw some of the things that we're struggling with today. But also, what impresses me in reading his dissents is his clear awareness of the human suffering, just like Eliza was talking about, the people whose problems brought them to the court to begin with. And I love this approach because over the years, reading dissents and writing dissents, I got concerned maybe that when you get lost in the fight of battling dictionaries and battling footnotes, that it really serves as a camouflage for the injustice that you're fighting about. So sometimes simpler is better, and he was good at that. The other thing that struck me about his dissents was how breathtakingly current they are. I mean, the things that he was saying then are the things that my colleagues or former colleagues are still probably sitting over there in the courthouse writing about tonight. For example, and again, for the civil rights case, this was in 1883 that those opinions issued. And he, again, he'd been on the court about 6 years. He talked about how you're not following the purpose of the law. I mean, they were talking about these civil rights statutes that had just been enacted, and he knew that the purpose of those statutes was to provide for equal treatment of the people who had been enslaved, the freed slaves. But what he said was, quote, "It's not the words of the law, but the internal sense of the law, the internal sense of it that makes the law. The letter of the law is the body, the sense and the reason of the law is the soul." Well, I mean, those of you who suffer with textualists, recognize that it seems now that we've lost that battle. As Justice Kagan says, we're all textualists now. But somehow when I read it and realized that this argument has been going on now for over 100 years, maybe it's not such a bad argument after all, and maybe we haven't seen the end of how that argument's going to play out. Also in the civil rights cases, Justice Harlan made other arguments that we hear today. One, again, the majority of the court said, the Congress didn't have the power to enact these statutes that reach this discrimination in the states, and Justice Harlan's said, well, wait a minute. That's not what you said yesterday in the cases when you upheld the Fugitive Slave Act. He said Congress, in the Fugitive Slave Act cases where the court upheld those statutes, the court said Congress had the authority to place the power of the whole nation behind the slave owners. He said the majority allowed for the empowerment of commissioners that were provided for in the statute to help enforce the statute. And that sounds a little familiar today as well. He quoted the majority as commanding, the majority in the Fugitive Slave Act cases, commanding all good citizens to assist in the Fugitive Slave Act's prompt and efficient execution whenever their services were required to do so. So he called out the hypocrisy of the court for providing that Congress was powerful when there was a need to keep enslaved people with their slave owner, but weak when it came to preventing racial discrimination. And we still hear those kind of arguments made in courts today and by judges today. His most famous dissent was Plessy versus Ferguson, of course. At that time, he'd been on the court closer to 20 years, so I found it interesting. All of a sudden, he's engaging in textualism himself. You can't beat him, you join him. He quoted extensively from the amendments and from the Supreme Court precedent. He hypothesized about the absurd result if the doctrine of separate but equal were applied in other contexts. But I think my particular favorite was he complained about judicial activism. This is in 1896, and this is what he said. Quote, "There's a dangerous tendencies in these latter days to enlarge the functions of the court by means of judicial interference with the will of the people as expressed by the legislature." 1896. So what do we make of this, that these arguments that we're having today have been with us for so long and a part of people's view of the law since the beginning, really? What it reminded me of was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which he gave in 1963, in which he began by referencing the Emancipation Proclamation from 1863. So he opened it with, for 100 years, we've been at this effort. He talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. Dr. King said, quote, "It was a great reckoning, a great beckoning light to hope," I'm not going to be able to read this, "a great beckoning light of hope to millions of slaves who had been seared in flames of withering injustice." But then the next line, he referred again to the 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, where the newly freed slaves had suffered in poverty, discrimination, segregation. And I think what he was, and he did it 3 times, 100 years, 100 years, 100 years. And I think what he was telling us is our work is really never over. We can accomplish things, we can reach goals, but it doesn't mean we don't have to get up the next day and do it again. I was talking with my friend Susan Cole about this, and she had just read a new book that involved interviews of Ta-Nehisi Coates. And the question was put to him, how do you cope with the idea that racial equality is just never going to be reached in your lifetime? I don't have the quote exactly, but he said, well, you still have to decide how you're going to live your life. He said for him it was a privilege to see himself on the line since 1619, to the present, and even though it's not the job's not going to be finished during his lifetime. He said you don't live your life based on whether or not you're going to win the game or you're going to see the victory in the game. you have to decide how you're going to live your life regardless, knowing that you've got to carry on the fight. So I'm going to close with a return to Justice Harlan. Peter Canlis talked about his end. He died in 1911, and he had always known great health, Justice Harlan. So Canlis said that he was really impatient with his last illness, but that he, quote, felt secure in the legacy he had built on earth, which gave him hope for prosperity, his and his nation's. So that is my wish for you, current and future legal legends. I hope that you can live your life with the purpose of the Great Dissenter, so that when you look back, you'll feel the same satisfaction with the life that you've led and with the same hope for the future of our country.
Student volunteers, Eliza for a marvelous introduction, and obviously Judge you for being such an inspiration. On a personal note, I have practiced in front of dozens of state court judges in my dozen years of practice now, and I've seen many who have completely forgotten the humanity of the people before them, who've either forgotten or no longer care that, yes, this matter that I'm arguing before them is the most important thing in that litigant's life. So thank you for standing up for the underdog, for the least of us. And I believe that, like Justice Harlan, your record is going to stand on the right side of history, and you are right in most of those dissents. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, and have a wonderful evening.